Case number 1 is that of Eric Arceneaux, Houston, Texas. On the surface, just another sprawling city where people chase careers, raise families, and try to build something stable. And that's exactly the world Maria Jimenez Rodriguez lived in. A young paralegal, dedicated, responsible, and trusted. She believed in structure, in routine, in showing up for the people who counted on her. That reliability was her strength, and tragically, the very trait that exposed the betrayal at the heart of this case. Because when Maria suddenly stopped coming to work, no calls, no explanations, her co-workers immediately knew something was wrong. It wasn't drama, it wasn't impulsiveness, it was a fracture in the pattern of a woman who never slipped, and the crack led straight to someone she thought she could rely on, Eric Arceneaux. According to investigators, Arceneaux wasn't the chaotic type you could spot from across the room. He played the calm, quiet figure, the man who appeared reasonable, predictable. But behind closed doors, Maria's disappearance began to reveal a side of him that felt less like a person and more like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. Think about that for a moment, the dissonance between a normal facade and the kind of violence police say unfolded in his home. When detectives searched his residence, the story they uncovered was unthinkable. They believed Maria was murdered there, killed in a place she likely felt safe enough to visit. And what happened next pulled this case into a uniquely chilling category. Investigators allege Arceneaux used a chainsaw to dismember her body, intentionally destroying evidence, intentionally erasing a human being he had no right to touch, let alone harm. It was methodical. It was staged. It was the kind of act that reveals not panic, but control. Digital forensics did what human eyes couldn't. Phone records, movements, and timelines tightened around him like a noose. When paired with the incriminating evidence found in his home, prosecutors built a narrative that led to his arrest and charges of murder and tampering with evidence, charges that speak not only to the taking of a life, but the deliberate mutilation that followed. And here's the quiet, uncomfortable truth this case leaves behind. Trust isn't always broken in loud moments. Sometimes it's shattered by someone who smiles at you, texts you back, and pretends to be safe. Maria's story is a reminder that real danger often hides behind ordinary faces, and when it reveals itself, the consequences can echo far beyond the crime scene. Case number 2 is that of Marques Potts. Before Melissa Fowler met him, she was rebuilding, slowly but steadily, after a difficult chapter in her life. Friends described her as hopeful, someone trying to reclaim joy one day at a time. And standing beside her was a man who was supposed to be a partner, not a threat. But with Marques Potts, the betrayal begins long before the final act. He was already on probation for a previous stabbing, already carrying a history of violent outbursts that should have been a warning. Yet he presented himself as changed, calmer, ready to be better. Melissa wanted to believe that. Many people do. That's the cruel part about trust. It's only ever proven wrong in hindsight. As their relationship deepened, the cracks widened. Potts's volatility didn't fade, it sharpened. Arguments escalated faster, moments of jealousy flared brighter, and each warning sign gathered behind him like storm clouds that only he pretended not to see. For Melissa, those red flags were pieces of a puzzle she never had the chance to complete. In 2023, everything finally reached its breaking point. Investigators say that during yet another outburst, this one fueled by the same rage that marked his earlier crime, Potts fatally stabbed Melissa. One moment of violence, they said, but shaped by a pattern that had been building for years. What makes this crime so suffocating is the simplicity of the betrayal. A man who promised to change delivered only the same cruelty everyone had feared he would repeat. And this time, it claimed the life of someone who believed he could be better. The investigation didn't drag on. Potts's history, combined with physical evidence and witness information, led officers directly to him. Prosecutors charged him with murder, a step that underscored the reality that his second chance was never real. Not for him, and certainly not for Melissa. His probation wasn't a redemption arc. It was a countdown. And in the aftermath, this case leaves behind a brutal lesson. People who rewrite their pasts with words often reveal the truth with their actions. Melissa wanted to believe in change. and that hope is not a flaw, it's human. But when a person refuses to confront their own violence, it's only a matter of time before that violence finds someone else. Case number 3 is that of Henry David Cassette. Sarah Goodwin lived a quiet, disciplined life, the kind built on careful routines and small joys. She wasn't reckless, she wasn't impulsive, and she didn't surround herself with dangerous people. That's what makes the betrayal at the center of this case so suffocating. She let Henry David Cassette into her world because he seemed steady, unthreatening, almost painfully ordinary. And in true tragic irony, it was that very ordinariness that disguised the darkness waiting beneath. Cassette wasn't a stranger lurking in an alleyway. He was someone Sarah trusted enough to spend time with, someone she believed existed safely within the limits of her life. But trust, once placed in the wrong hands, can become a weapon. In 2022, in what he later described as a moment of rage, Cassette strangled Sarah to death. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a flash of uncontrolled emotion. It was a deliberate act that stole her final breath, an act made even more chilling by what came next. Because after killing her, Cassette didn't call for help. He didn't turn himself in. Instead, investigators say he moved with a disturbing calm. He dismembered Sarah's body in his own bathtub, using tools he had easy access to, before scattering her remains in an attempt to erase any trace of her existence. It was a sequence of choices that transformed one crime into another, each step revealing a deeper, colder layer of his cruelty. Think about that for a moment. A man capable of such violence, also believing he could outsmart the world by cutting it into pieces. But fate and guilt have a way of cornering people like him. Cassette eventually confessed, unraveling under the weight of what he had done. His own words became the final link in a chain of evidence, allowing prosecutors to build a clear and damning case. He was charged with murder and tampering with evidence, facing a system that had little sympathy for someone who killed, dismembered, and discarded a woman who trusted him. And the thematic punch here is brutal in its simplicity. Evil doesn't always arrive with warning signs or dramatic entrances. Sometimes it smiles softly, speaks calmly, and walks into your home like it belongs there. Sarah's story reminds us that the most dangerous betrayals often come from the people we least expect. And once that line is crossed, there is no way back, only the long shadow of justice trying to make sense of what remains. Case number 4 is that of James Ray Lane. Gregory Moore wasn't the kind of man who lived recklessly. He kept his circle small, valued his privacy, and tried to build something meaningful with the woman he was dating. That relationship should have been a place of comfort, but instead, it became the point where jealousy, obsession, and insecurity collided into something fatal. Because while Moore believed he was spending a quiet evening with his girlfriend at an Airbnb, someone else was watching from the shadows, someone who felt entitled to control her long after the relationship had died. Someone named James Ray Lane. Lane's betrayal didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on a foundation of possessiveness he refused to let go of. Investigators later learned he had been tracking his ex-girlfriend's cell phone, stalking her movements, studying her patterns, and fueling himself with a narrative that painted Moore as the villain in a story he was writing entirely in his own mind. That's the dangerous irony here. Lane imagined himself as the wounded party, even as he quietly plotted an ambush. When Lane traced the signal to an Airbnb in 2021, he arrived not to talk, not to resolve anything, but prepared to kill. Prosecutors said the ambush was swift and calculated. Lane confronted Moore outside the property and opened fire. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was a choice sharpened by fixation, a violent act driven by the belief that he could reclaim control by taking a life. Moore never stood a chance. Lane fled, but the plan he thought was airtight unraveled almost instantly. Digital breadcrumbs told the story for him. The phone tracking, the messages, the route he took, the footage that placed him near the Airbnb. The very technology he used to stalk became the same technology that trapped him in a corner he couldn't escape. At trial, prosecutors laid out a narrative of obsession turned homicidal. Lane was convicted of Moore's murder, sentenced under the weight of evidence that reflected not only violence, but premeditation. His sentence marked the end of his fantasy of control and the beginning of accountability. The lingering truth of this case is painfully clear. Obsession disguised as love isn't devotion, it's possession. And when someone believes another person belongs to them, every boundary becomes negotiable in their mind. Moore died because someone refused to accept that no is an ending, not an invitation to pursue the darkness further. Case number 5 is that of Deontray Flanagan. Some betrayals are subtle, slow burns that unravel over time. But this one? It was loud, chaotic, and impossible to rationalize, because at the center of it all was a 2-year-old girl named Zaya Marie, a child whose entire world depended on the one person who should have protected her above all else, her father, Deontray Flanagan. And that is where the moral fracture begins. A breakup, a disagreement between adults, should never spill over into the life of a child. Yet for Flanagan, anger became gasoline, and his daughter became the place where he set the fire. It started with a domestic dispute, the kind that leaves emotions scraped raw. But instead of stepping away or seeking help, Flanagan chose the most destructive path available. He fled with Zaya in the car, igniting a high-speed chase across Texas roads. Think about the mindset required for that. Speeding, weaving, running from police, while a toddler sat helpless in the back seat. That alone revealed a terrifying truth. Zaya's safety was no longer his priority. His ego was. When officers finally stopped the vehicle, the situation took a turn from reckless to unspeakably tragic. Flanagan had strangled his daughter during the chase, a moment prosecutors later described as an act born not of confusion, but of rage. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a catastrophic decision made in real time by a man who valued winning an argument over the life of his own child. Investigators pieced the story together quickly. Body cam footage, witness accounts, physical evidence inside the vehicle. Every layer painted the same picture. A father whose anger eclipsed every parental instinct he should have had. Flanagan was arrested on the spot, but the true weight of his actions settled in the courtroom, where prosecutors charged him with capital murder. The verdict mirrored the cruelty of the crime. Convicted. A life sentence. And yet the thematic punch here isn't just about the violence, it's about the irreversible consequence of letting emotion outrun reason. Zaya never chose the argument, she never chose the chase, she never chose the danger, but she paid the price for an adult who couldn't control his impulses. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When anger becomes a compass, it never points toward anything but destruction. Case number 6 is that of Kiana Mouton. Some crimes grow out of impulsive rage, but this one came from calculation, cold, deliberate, and engineered through manipulation. Kiana Mouton wasn't driven by a sudden loss of control. She planned the betrayal at the center of this case, and she weaponized something most of us underestimate: the power of influence. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she knew exactly who she could use to get it. And the tragedy is that her target, 18-year-old student Dincy Mack, never stood a chance against a plan crafted long before he realized he was in danger. Dincy was described as respectful, focused, the kind of young man who stayed out of chaos. But one of Mouton's associates developed a crush on him, a harmless dynamic on its own. Mouton twisted that crush into bait. Investigators later said she orchestrated everything: the lure, the location, the timing. She convinced her accomplice to bring Dincy to her under the guise of interest or connection, when in reality the meeting was nothing more than a setup for an execution-style killing. Think about that level of betrayal, using affection as a trapdoor. The night of the murder unfolded exactly as Mouton designed it. Dincy arrived, unaware he had walked into an ambush. Within moments, shooters, acting under Mouton's direction, opened fire, hitting him multiple times. There was no confrontation, no argument, no chance for him to defend himself. It was swift, predatory, and rooted in Mouton's desire to resolve her personal grudges through lethal violence. She didn't pull the trigger herself, but she pulled every string. Investigators quickly noticed the inconsistencies among the people involved. Digital messages exposed the orchestration. Phone records showed coordination. The crush that brought Dincy to the scene became the critical link, revealing that the entire situation had been staged. As detectives peeled back the layers, Mouton emerged not just as a participant, but as the architect. In court, prosecutors laid out the story piece by piece: the manipulation, the planning, the deadly ambush. Mouton was convicted of murder, held accountable for the life she engineered others to take. Her sentencing reflected both her role and her intent, showing that directing violence from the background still carries the full weight of consequence. And the moral here is sharp. Influence can be as dangerous as any weapon. Mouton didn't need a gun in her hand to end a life. She used trust, affection, and persuasion as tools. Dincy's death reminds us that sometimes the most lethal person in a crime is the one standing just outside the frame. Case number 7 is that of Quan Travian Boyd. Kiana Smith was 21, pregnant, and trying to rebuild her life with cautious optimism. She had a job, a plan, and a belief, however fragile, that she could step into motherhood on her own terms. But the person standing in her way wasn't a stranger or an enemy or even circumstance. It was someone she had once trusted, her boyfriend, Quan Travian Boyd. And that is where the deepest betrayal in this case takes root. Because for Kiana, the danger wasn't lurking in the dark, it was walking beside her. Their relationship had already begun to crack, weighed down by control, tension, and the looming responsibilities Boyd didn't want to face. Instead of stepping up, he chose resentment. And resentment, when allowed to fester, becomes a blueprint for tragedy. The turning point came in 2021 when Kiana texted a friend in fear, saying she believed Boyd was angry, that he wasn't listening, that something felt wrong. Minutes later, she vanished. What investigators would later uncover was a sequence of events both calculated and merciless. Boyd abducted Kiana, forcing her into a vehicle and taking her away from the safety of her home. What followed was not a momentary lapse or a heated accident, it was violence sharpened into intent. Prosecutors allege Boyd shot Kiana, killing both her and her unborn baby. He didn't just end a life, he ended 2 futures at once. The investigation unraveled quickly. Surveillance footage captured movements that contradicted Boyd's story. Phone data showed he had been with her. And the chilling detail, Kiana's last text message, sent to warn someone she trusted, became one of the key pieces of evidence closing the circle around him. Within days, Boyd was arrested and charged with capital murder. In the courtroom, prosecutors laid out a narrative of motive, opportunity, and refusal to accept responsibility. The charge of capital murder reflected the full weight of what he had taken, a mother and a child who never had the chance to be born. The community mourned not just a life lost, but a life never allowed to begin. And the thematic punch here is heavy. Some people mistake control for love, and when control slips from their hands, they choose destruction over acceptance. Kiana's story is a reminder that leaving a toxic relationship isn't just difficult, it can be dangerous. She tried to walk away toward a better life, and in doing so exposed a truth many victims learn too late. The most dangerous moment is often the one when you finally decide to stop surviving someone else's chaos. Case number 8 is that of Luis Luna. There is perhaps no duty more primal, more instinctual than the protection of an infant. A child of that age is entirely defenseless, viewing their parents not just as caregivers, but as their entire universe. But for 8-month-old Savia Mason, that universe was a trap. In August 2020, in West Harris County, Texas, the facade of fatherhood concealed a predator who was supposed to be a protector. The incident began with the kind of chaotic panic that usually elicits sympathy. On August 24th, Luis Luna, then 23 years old, called 911. He reported that his daughter, Savia, was unresponsive. When paramedics arrived at the apartment, Luna played the part of the distraught father to perfection, claiming he had found her not breathing and had attempted CPR. To the first responders, it looked like a medical tragedy, a fragile life suddenly fading. But as Savia was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead, the medical reality began to dismantle Luna's performance. The turn in this case wasn't a confession, but a forensic revelation that horrified even seasoned investigators. The autopsy didn't show a medical episode, it showed a massacre. Spivey hadn't just stopped breathing, she had been suffocated. Even darker, the medical examiner found clear, undeniable evidence of sexual assault and blunt force trauma. Inside Luna's apartment, investigators found bloody baby wipes, a crude attempt to clean up a crime scene that defied comprehension. The betrayal here was absolute. Spivey's mother had dropped her off for visitation, trusting the biological father with their child, only for him to inflict what prosecutors later called the worst kind of evil. In October 2024, nearly 4 years after the crime, justice finally caught up with Luis Luna. The evidence was so overwhelming that the defense of accidental death, or failed CPR, was rendered absurd. He was convicted of capital murder. In Texas, a capital murder conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole when the death penalty is not sought. Luna will die in a concrete cell, never again to breathe free air. But think about the silence in that courtroom. The prosecutor noted that Spivey couldn't walk, couldn't talk, and had no voice to beg for her life. The verdict wasn't just a punishment, it was the only way the world could finally scream for her. Justice was served, but it serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place for a child isn't a dark alley, but their own crib. Case number 9 is that of Antonio AJ Armstrong Jr. In family homes, trust is supposed to be the strongest bond, the safety net that children grow up inside of. For Antonio Armstrong Sr. and his wife Dawn, that belief was unshakable. They poured their energy into building a stable life, raising their children with structure, discipline, and opportunity. And that's precisely why this case leaves such a deep ache. The betrayal did not come from an outsider or a sudden threat. It came from within their own home, from someone they loved without hesitation. Their teenage son, AJ Armstrong Jr. AJ was known for struggling academically, and the tension around his slipping grades became a quiet but recurring issue inside the household. His parents pushed him, not unkindly, but firmly, believing that discipline would help him find direction. But instead of growing from it, AJ internalized it. According to prosecutors, resentment brewed in the background, hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary family dynamic. In 2016, that underlying tension turned into tragedy. Armstrong Sr. and Dawn were found shot while they slept, an act that shocked not only the community, but the nation. Investigators quickly realized there were no signs of forced entry, no strangers, no intruders. The threat had come from someone already inside the home. Evidence, inconsistencies in AJ's statements, and the circumstances surrounding the scene led detectives to focus on him as the primary suspect. What followed was a lengthy legal journey, multiple trials, hung juries, and a courtroom filled with emotional testimony. Prosecutors described a pattern of frustration and impulsivity they believed culminated in the parents' deaths. The defense argued otherwise, insisting AJ was innocent. But in the final trial, the jury reached a verdict. AJ Armstrong Jr. was convicted of murdering his parents. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, a punishment reflecting both the severity of the crime and the deliberate nature prosecutors attributed to him. And the moral weight of this case is sobering. A family's greatest strength, its closeness, can also mask fractures no one recognizes until it's too late. The Armstrongs built a home filled with expectations, love, and faith, believing that foundation was solid. But sometimes the deepest betrayal isn't loud or obvious. Sometimes it lies quietly in someone's unspoken resentment, surfacing only when it's far too late to save what once held a family together. Case number 10 is that of Renard Spivey. We often operate under the assumption that a badge acts as a shield, not just for the officer wearing it, but for the moral fabric of the community they serve. We assume that those trained to de-escalate violence, those sworn to uphold the law, possess a discipline that follows them home when the uniform comes off. But in July 2019, in a quiet home in Harris County, Texas, that assumption was shattered by the crack of a firearm. The man pulling the trigger wasn't a career criminal, he was a sheriff's deputy, and the person on the other end of the barrel was his wife, Patricia. The incident unfolded in the hazy, desperate hours of the early morning. A 911 call came in around 3 a.m., a time when nothing good ever happens. On the line was Renard Spivey, a man known for his imposing physical stature. He had once appeared on a reality show as a bailiff and was a fitness enthusiast. He told the dispatcher, "We were tussling with the gun. I accidentally shot her." When officers arrived, his own colleagues in blue, they found a scene of domestic devastation. Patricia Spivey lay dead in the master bedroom closet, shot twice. Renard was also wounded, taking a bullet to the leg. The narrative immediately fractured. Renard claimed self-defense. He painted a picture of a marital dispute gone wrong, alleging that Patricia, suspecting him of infidelity or steroid use, had become enraged and reached for the weapon. He argued that in the struggle for control of the gun, it discharged, killing her and wounding him. But investigators saw a different story. They saw a man who significantly overpowered his wife. They saw a tussle that resulted in 2 fatal shots to the victim's chest, while the shooter walked away with a survivable wound, a wound prosecution later argued could have been self-inflicted to sell the narrative. The turn in this case wasn't a forensic breakthrough, but a marathon of legal delays and a shocking conclusion in the courtroom. It took 4 years for this case to reach a jury. During the trial in December 2023, the defense leaned heavily on the reasonable doubt standard, dissecting the forensic evidence to support the claim that Patricia was the aggressor. The prosecution painted Renard as a cold-blooded killer who staged a scene to cover up domestic murder. In a verdict that gasped the courtroom, the jury sided with the defense. Renard Spivey was found not guilty. He was acquitted of all charges. There was no sentencing, no prison bus waiting to take him away. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, legally absolved of the crime. But pause for a moment and consider the weight of that silence left behind. The law has spoken, and in the eyes of the state, Renard is innocent. Yet, Patricia is still gone. Her voice was silenced in a closet, in the dark, by a man sworn to protect life. Acquittal is a legal term. It means not proven. It does not always mean didn't happen. In the end, only 2 people know exactly who pulled that trigger and why. One is free to walk the streets, and the other took the truth with her to the grave.